FGTV partners with Student Leadership Johns Creek and Georgia Humanities for this special presentation. Please enjoy They Were Here, the future of the preservation and commemoration of the Macedonia African Methodist Cemetery.
Hello, I'm Fulton County Vice Chairman Liz Hausman. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch a thorough and enlightening historic documentary about a forgotten chapter in Fulton County's rich African American history. Produced exclusively by Student Leadership Johns Creek, an organization of high school students, the four-part film takes an extensive look at Macedonia African Methodist Cemetery in the northeast corner of our county in my home city of Johns Creek. The film premiered earlier this spring to rave reviews wherever it has played. This team of North Fulton students managed all of the filming, the editing, the script writing, and the voiceover recording. Home to approximately 105 graves of former slaves and their descendants, Macedonia Cemetery, sadly, was nearly forgotten as residential and commercial development surrounded the property. However, thanks to a dedicated team of local preservationists, professional historians, and your elected officials, the cemetery is being preserved and restored so that the men and women buried there will forever be remembered. The film you are about to see tells this story. While part of this may be difficult to watch, it is a very important story to tell. Under the guidance of volunteer Executive Director Irene Sanders, the Macedonia African Methodist Cemetery story has been preserved for audiences across Fulton County and indeed across the country. I hope you enjoy learning about our local history as much as these young adults enjoyed putting this documentary together. It is our pleasure to present to you the story of the Macedonia African Methodist Cemetery in Johns Creek, Georgia.
Highlighting the history of our nation's past creates learning opportunities and gives chances to bring to light past experiences, essential landmarks, and promotes growth within our society. The Macedonia African Methodist Cemetery, located in Johns Creek, Georgia, is home to over 100 burials, including former enslaved African Americans. It serves an essential role in retelling the story of the period after the Civil War. We start with the end to the raging American Civil War in April of 1865, with General Robert E. Lee surrender on behalf of the Confederacy. But the Union did not neatly piece itself back together. According to Dr. Kendra McCrae, Associate Professor of History at Atlanta Metropolitan State College and Visiting Professor of History at Georgia Tech, the city of Atlanta and the area was devastated. Thousands of acres of farmland had been destroyed. Factories were destroyed. Railroads pulled up and twisted. African American and white American homes were destroyed. Plantations were destroyed, including quarters for African American slaves. There was hunger, no way to make a living, even for people trying to make a way of life. But amidst the chaos, President Lincoln presented a plan for Reconstruction to bring the Southern states back into the Union, starting with Congress, to ratify 3 amendments to the Constitution. Johnson's presidency set the stage for Southern opposition to Reconstruction to grow and gain momentum. This drawing was a representation of the scales of justice tipping in the South's favor, after Johnson chose to veto a bill that would fund the military control of the South, and the primary target of the Southerners' hate was African Americans. White Southerners partook in lynching of black men and even teenagers who were accused of crimes but never had access to fair trial. Some even contended that these conditions were worse than slavery.
So there was a lot of hunger, there was a lot of homelessness. People were without a way to make a living, feed their families, and so they're trying to make a way.
the South was still a heavily agrarian society, and this led to sharecropping and tenant farming. In these practices, landowners, who were mostly white, would lend housing, tools, seeds, and land to African Americans in exchange for a share of their crops at harvest time. The 13th Amendment abolished most forms of slavery and declared that owning slaves was a crime punishable by the law. The 14th Amendment established due process and granted citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the United States. This amendment overturned the decision of the Supreme Court in the landmark Dred Scott case, which denied U.S. citizenship to all people of African descent. The 15th Amendment extended voting rights to all men, including the newly emancipated former slaves. These developments pushed white supremacists and the Ku Klux Klan to find alternative ways of bypassing the law and keeping African Americans marginalized.
Minstrels were white, usually males, who would dress up and paint their faces black and draw on big red lips to caricature African Americans. And they would do things in a very exaggerated, often degrading manner that were supposed to be imitating African Americans. So the era was named after this practice. If it was difficult for you to get a job, right? You had been enslaved and now you're looking for a job, it becomes illegal to not have a job. And once a person was arrested, they might be arrested and fined. If they couldn't pay the fine, well, how could you pay the fine? You hadn't been paid, you didn't get any back pay for all the labor you had done, right? Then you could essentially be sold to the highest bidder.
After a significant win for the African American rights, the South had found a way through the legislature to reverse all these gains and marginalize the people and keep them from exercising their full citizenship rights. This new condition pushed the rise of a new movement. In the 1880s, institutions in the South were created to educate and support African American communities. This new condition pushed the rise of a new movement. In the 1880s, institutions in the South were created to educate and support African American communities.
Most African Americans, because of the legacy of slavery, because of Jim Crow, are very, very economically disadvantaged at the time. African Americans are being disenfranchised, they're kept from voting at the time, facing tremendous odds, but at the same time, they're institution building. So they're building churches like Macedonia Church. The African American community is very interested in institution building in this way. During the Progressive Era and during Reconstruction, they were very interested in getting educated. So I listed some colleges. Morehouse College was formed during Reconstruction, Spelman College.
After Reconstruction ended, the United States experienced a second industrial revolution and a progressive era during the late 1800s and early 1900s. During this time, activists like Ida B. Wells tried to expose the discrimination and violence that African Americans faced in the North and the South. America's involvement in World War I in 1917 brought an unprecedented change in the industrial regions of the North, Midwest, and West. Because many working men, including African American soldiers, had left to fight the war in Europe, industrial efforts, crucial to producing weapons and necessary war supplies, were suffering from a significant labor shortage. These regions then turned their gaze to the South, where the number of laborers was abundant. Many companies got African Americans from the South to work in their factories, with promises of better working and living conditions in the North. This caused the era known as the Great Migration. Population in cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Pittsburgh snowballed as many African Americans looking for a new place to work and to escape racial violence and discrimination in the South left in search of greater, greener pastures. This is where a common misconception about racism in the United States is addressed. African Americans migrated outside the South. These new places in the North were not completely devoid of racism. We see a new form of racism outside the South in the Great Migration era, written in social custom rather than in law.
But African Americans who went north may face overcrowding in certain areas that were designated, socially for African Americans only. and other places for whites only, right? And other places were the Jewish section of town, right? The Irish lived over here, right? And a lot of that segregation was what we would call de facto. It was just a matter of fact. It was a social custom. So in certain ways, that was a harder kind of oppression. That was a harder obstacle to face because it was really fleeting. It was often hard to prove. It wasn't written in black and white like Southern ordinances.
Conditions like these brought out the importance of Black institutions to provide support and protection from racial violence and discrimination. Many people started new lives away from their family and familiar homes, in places in the North that still saw them as the other. When African Americans who moved north returned to the South, institutions like Macedonia gave the African American community a sense of comfort and support that pushed them through the new set of struggles when they were away from home.
The importance of a cemetery like Macedonia is to memorialize ordinary people. And if we really believe that our lives matter, my life matters, your lives matter, everybody's life matters, then we would understand the importance of memorializing everyday people as well and preserving their memories.
Today, the Macedonia Cemetery serves as a foothold to all of the past, creating a look at how the grim world around affected a local American community amid Reconstruction, the Progressive Era, and the Great Migration. The cemetery also allows us to preserve the souls and memories of those who once lived here.
The history of Macedonia Cemetery mirrors the history of the United States of America itself, and it's fascinating that Johns Creek is at the epicenter of that. You really see at the cemetery, with its history, the confluence of the Native Americans, the slaves, and of course the white settlers, and the different milestones and monumental events in the United States, especially with the Civil War. And then with the Civil Rights Movement, all of that you can see in the cemetery's history.
Every community has a history, and having young people and other citizens in a community work together to preserve these histories says a lot about our values as a city and as a community. The way we preserve our history is a reflection of the values that we hold, especially in a city like Johns Creek, which is relatively new, almost 20 years old. And these documentaries dispel the assumption that there is no history here, when in fact there is a very rich history here and in other communities across the state and around the country of the diverse experiences and challenges and achievements of diverse people. And everybody's had a hand in contributing to where we live today.
We will be right back with more of They Were Here, the future of the preservation and commemoration of the Macedonia African Methodist Cemetery. More of They Were Here, the future of the preservation and commemoration of the Macedonia African Methodist Cemetery.
People are constantly moving in and out of metropolitan and suburban areas, but our ancestors buried at the Macedonia Cemetery will be here forever. We can learn a lot from the people who lived here, died here, and are buried here in the Macedonia Cemetery. Around the area where the Macedonia Cemetery is located, communities were established and inhabited by white settlers, enslaved African Americans, and indigenous people. Over time, more white settlers moved into Native American lands, including the now Johns Creek area.
Cherokee Native Americans, prior to European contact, were mostly here in the northern part or upper Piedmont area of the state of Georgia. But it also encompassed, the Carolinas, both north and south, and swooping around into Tennessee and also Alabama. This big, huge area geographically. They basically lived in kind of like, I guess what you would think of as like neighborhoods today, complete with neighborhood fence that surrounded all of the houses. So everybody in the neighborhood was like a little village, right? So every family would have their houses, and they usually had 2 houses a year. They would have a summer house and then a winter house. And they had, of course, regular village life, and in their neighborhood, they would have the fence that surrounded the homes and the family, and of course a center kind of court or area where they could meet, and then a longhouse usually. And that was like where the village would get together, and then the court was kind of like the size of a football or soccer field, and they could play games and stuff like that on there. Now outside the fence is where all of their crops were, and they would plant crops kind of all together, all surrounding. And of course you have, men would go out and go hunting and fishing and all of that stuff. That's pretty much how it was pre-contact.
Several notable Cherokee figures lived in present-day Johns Creek. George Morgan Waters was part Cherokee. He was educated in Britain and owned several hundred acres of plantation land near today's Macedonia Cemetery. Waters also held 120 enslaved African Americans. Improvements made to his land valued at $14,375.50, showing his extreme wealth. He freed about half of his enslaved African Americans in his will. Once the white settlers arrived, the Cherokees' long and tumultuous history in Georgia around the area of the Macedonia Cemetery was a crucial factor to consider in the development and history of the environment around the graveyard.
We get into the early 19th century, so early 1800s, where gold was discovered in Dahlonega, which is in the northern portion of our state. And once gold, you said that word, all of the Europeans said, well, we have to get all of those Native Americans out of here, and because we have to have that gold and we have to have that land. And so that's when you start getting into federal intervention, state intervention of removing the Native Americans, not just the Cherokee, but Cherokee, Creek, Muskogee, all of them, forcibly removing them.
White settlers moved to North Georgia in hopes of becoming rich beyond belief through the gold and owning hundreds of acres of land. According to Ms. Cobb, many white settlers were interested in trading with the Cherokee before forced eviction. White trappers and traders established small frontier shops like stores, restaurants, and newspaper trading posts between settlements and villages.
Diverse groups interacted along just fine, depending on where you were. If you were a white settler or frontiersman moving here to the north part of Georgia, interacting with Native Americans, usually they got along just fine. If it's a one white person versus a large group of Native Americans, the white person is going to get along just fine. They're probably even going to maybe even intermarry, have families together, or maybe even move into that village, that Native American village. Now, when the U.S. military came here and forced those Cherokees to move and go on the Trail of Tears, several of those, or a lot, a good portion of them, of enslaved people moved along with the Cherokee people and resettled in what is now what we know as Oklahoma.
Presidents of Johns Creek, such as John Rogers and his 2 oldest sons, who were part Native Americans, advocated for the rights of the Cherokee as more white settlers moved into North Georgia and desired land and resources. The Cherokee filed a lawsuit challenging the Indian Removal Act. In the Supreme Court case Worcester v. Georgia in 1832, the court ruled that the Cherokee lived in their nation and could not leave Georgia. However, the state of Georgia and Andrew Jackson ignored the ruling and continued with the forced Cherokee removal. As a result, the Cherokee Nation challenged and resisted forced removal from their lands. For example, John Rogers, a wealthy resident of present-day Johns Creek, and head of a Cherokee family. He was notably friends with Andrew Jackson and married Sarah Condrey. He had 9 sons and 3 daughters with his wife. He built a house on the Chattahoochee River, which he refused to leave even when the white settlers attempted to force his family out. Despite the challenges to forced removal, members of the Cherokee Nation, including family members of Major Ridge and John Rowland Ridge, signed a removal agreement with the United States government at New Echota in 1835 against the wishes of most Cherokee. This New Echota Treaty was a subject of contention among the Cherokee. It required the Cherokee to exchange their lands for a parcel in the Indian Territory in Oklahoma and relocate within 2 years. This treaty was motivated by the greed of federal government and white settlers who coveted Cherokee lands. After it was signed, Chief John Ross, a prominent chief who helped write the Cherokee Constitution, gathered over 1,000 Cherokee signatures against the treaty. This provided that the majority of the tribe was not in agreement. Eventually, the Cherokee were forcibly removed by the U.S. Army and sent on the Trail of Tears, where 4,000 to 5,000 people died. Before the white settlement of the United States, slavery was practiced in some Native American societies, including the Cherokee. Enslaved Native Americans became common currency between Native nations throughout the Americas, often traded for ammunition, tools, and food. According to a 2017 Time magazine article, Indian slavery never went away, but rather coexisted with African slavery from the 16th century throughout the 19th century. Slavery across parts of Cherokee society, specifically in Georgia, was a strategy to build a complex political alliance. When European colonists arrived, they brought a system of slavery based on forced labor and profit. As a result, some Native American societies enslaved African Americans to work on plantations. In 1838, the Georgia militia expelled Cherokees from their homeland. Known as the Trail of Tears, the Cherokee Nation's removal enforced federal law, passed to respond to the rapid expansion of white settlers across Georgia and the Southeast. Families were taken out of their cabins and forced to leave most of their possessions behind. Throughout this exodus, Cherokee and enslaved African American lives were lost to disease, malnourishment, and mistreatment throughout the perilous journey from North Georgia to present-day Oklahoma. In addition to the hardships of the trip, enslaved blacks were forced to leave along with the Cherokee. As a result, much of the diversity seen in the area around the Macedonia cemetery is partly because African Americans and Cherokee themselves were forced into enslavement.
History is all about what happened, right? Who lived in the past? What decisions did they make? And how did that affect who we are today? And if we don't learn from that, how are we going to make things better?
With the events that took place, we will become more involved in studying our past and have a greater overall appreciation for the land we inhabit.
The Macedonia Cemetery project was one of those things where I felt like I was able to touch and connect with local history, and it meant a lot because every time we get asked about this, we're like, what does it mean to you? But to us, it means preserving something that's been so close to us but not recognized. And us working on this project not only led us to know what was there in the cemetery itself, but to find out more about the place we're living in and what diversity really means.
You know, anytime you can get the younger generation to really examine our history, I think that that's a positive for everybody. And of course, it can't be underscored enough that, you know, if you fail to remember your history, then you're destined to repeat it.
My experience working with the students has been probably one of the highlights of my 16-year teaching career. They were very engaged and motivated to do this project, and it wasn't an easy project, but they knew it had to be rigorous to do it right, because when you're dealing with preserving the stories of people, particularly people who are not alive anymore, we do have a responsibility to tell their stories as accurately as possible and to be respectful and to clearly communicate why these stories are still important today.
We will be right back with more of They Were Here, the future of the preservation and commemoration of the Macedonia African Methodist Cemetery. More of They Were Here, the future of the preservation and commemoration of the Macedonia African Methodist Cemetery.
A rather unassuming cemetery lies just on the side of Medlock Bridge Road. A Publix and a car wash flank it, and it is sequestered into a small green space behind the innumerable storefronts that make up the area around Johns Creek High School. There are at least 100 graves in the Macedonia African Methodist Church Cemetery, and within that small green space are some of the most impactful stories that this city has to offer. One of those stories is of a man named April Waters. If you were to visit the cemetery, April Waters would be one of the first names you'd see. On that headstone reads April Waters, died October 15th, 1910, age 65 years. His gravestone is a lot like his life, shrouded in mystery, with just enough information to make you want to learn more.
We have a history, and whether it's good, whether it's bad, the whole story needs to be told. It's just like any story. You have to tell the complete story.
It was long believed that Waters' life went as follows. He was born enslaved in 1845. He was freed upon the death of his owner, George Waters, in 1852. He moved to Liberia sometime as a young adult. Then he came back to America and lived a long and fulfilling life before dying in 1910. For a long while, it was believed that April Waters was a woman, even though there is pretty clear evidence that at least some of those assumptions were wrong. There wasn't enough known about April Waters to prove anything to the contrary. And after all, how important could a person be if there were only 9 words on their headstone? Chief among them were Joan Compton of the Johns Creek Historical Society and Majun Shahid, a U.S. Marine veteran with interest in his family's genealogy, and the founder and CEO of Hidden Voices, a nonprofit dedicated to helping other African Americans learn about their family trees.
As my job with Hidden Voices, I consider it to be a passion more so than a job. My responsibilities are to coach and help others to do the same thing that I did as far as researching my family tree, because a lot of people have questions, and I help them go and uncover all those different voices in their family tree that they want to know about.
He is also the great-great-grandson of April Waters.
My experience doing genealogy research started back in 1989. As a high school student, I had to do so many hours of volunteer work. And that volunteer work was in the library. And on the 5th floor of the Atlanta Public Library, they have a genealogy floor. And sometimes when I took breaks, I would get lost in the genealogy floor. And I went through rows of microfiche looking at different census records. And I started with the census records and also used different reference books for that particular time.
Mr. Shahid reached out to other historians and genealogists and attained a comprehensive view of April Waters' life.
The most interesting thing I found doing genealogy on my family was the will of George Waters. And he was the landowner, and in his will he mentioned my great-great-grandfather, April Waters, in the actual will.
April Waters was in fact not free with the death of George Waters in 1852. There is also no evidence that April Waters went to Liberia or even left the country for that matter.
It should be exposed more. A lot of people need to know about it. I think it holds questions to history for a lot of Americans that have gaps in their history, and it helped me connect the dots.
While many of George Waters' former enslaved African Americans appear on the 1857 passenger logs for voyages to Liberia, Waters does not. And since travel to Liberia essentially ended with the liberation of enslaved African Americans after the Civil War, it is improbable that April Waters ever went to Liberia. Additionally, we know that he lived in Georgia in 1867, as he signed the Reconstruction Oath in that year. This is also how Mr. Shahid found that April Waters was a man. as only men took the Reconstruction oath, since it was only necessary if one was an otherwise eligible voter. Although he attained freedom and emancipation, Waters was still left in poverty in the Jim Crow-era South. His tax records from 1874, 1882, and 1887 all show that he was financially poor. He owned no land and had very few assets. Records show that he was employed, but he worked a rather small farm. In 1887, the total of his property was taxed $25. After that, Waters disappeared from records entirely, and the final 23 years of his life remain a mystery. We know that he died in 1910 and was buried next to Macedonia Church. Mr. Shaheed hopes that these still undiscovered parts of April Waters' life will be the impetus for even more research.
I'm not done, it's continuous. So there's a lot of different things I'm finding out every year. I usually spend a little time doing my personal family tree every year.
Slavery has been a haunting part of the American history and in our community of Johns Creek.
The impact that it will have, the restoration and preserving the legacy of the cemetery will have a good impact on Johns Creek because it shows that Johns Creek is setting the example as far as maintaining the history and telling the complete story for other cities.
April Waters' journey is still upheld today as his descendant, Mr. Shaheed, with the help from the Johns Creek Historical Society, continues to research his ancestral past and the misconceptions surrounding his great-great-grandfather, April Waters.
Are young people that we're very proud of in Johns Creek, that they did these documentaries to such a high level of quality. And obviously their future is very bright, and I'm just excited that more people are going to get to know the story through the films about Macedonia.
Every time we get asked about this, we're like, what does it mean to you? But to us, it means preserving something that's been so close to us but not recognized. And us working on this project not only led us to know what was there in the cemetery itself, but to find out more about the place we're living in and what diversity really means.
We will be right back with more of They Were Here, the future of the preservation and commemoration of the Macedonia African Methodist Cemetery. More of They Were Here, the future of the preservation and commemoration of the Macedonia African Methodist Cemetery.
The Macedonia African Methodist Church Cemetery has a unique history filled with lost narratives of those buried there. However, in its current state, the cemetery faces many insurmountable problems, including fixing damaged headstones, preserving the land, and finding out more details about the deceased. Several preservation efforts by community members and groups in Johns Creek have been made over the past decade. In order to understand the process of preserving a historical site such as the Macedonia Cemetery, Jennifer Dickey, a history professor at Kennesaw University, and Ashley Shares, director of preservation at Oakland Cemetery, have given us insight into the preservation process and its impact on our community.
Are the descendants of the people who were buried here still in the area? Why or why not? Did they leave in the Great Migration? Are they still here? So it prompts us to want to explore these stories at an individual level and sort of drill down beyond just the big timeline of American history.
So a big part of what I do and how I conduct preservation is I help families and communities decide what are the most pressing preservation priorities, and help balance what they think is important with what might actually be materially important. Something might be someone's favorite headstone because it belongs to their grandfather, but it's not damaged, so there's not much that I should be doing with it, but then there's something that belongs to someone less well known that's broken, and in terms of preservation, that's a higher priority. So I help people decide, okay, you have a set amount of money, what can we do with that money that has the biggest impact? So that's one of the biggest things I do with a smaller cemetery. The fact that humans care for the dead and commemorate the dead is one of the things that separates us from any other species, any animal, right? So just the fact that we care for a cemetery is important, and we should do it because it's what makes us human. On another level, often cemeteries are the only remaining part of a community that is now gone. Like the church is gone, the houses these people probably lived in are all gone. This is the only actual, you can touch it. It's the only tangible link to the past that these people have. These people probably don't have a single book written about them. There's nothing, they don't have a house, they don't have anything left. So to have a part of history that you can actually touch, people connect with that more than just reading it in a book.
After being neglected since 1990, the Macedonia Cemetery has been the subject of numerous preservation attempts aimed to restore the cemetery and preserve its history. Shortly after being declared abandoned with no apparent owner, Fulton County acquired maintenance rights to the property and aided in early contributions for Macedonia's preservation. From the 1990s to present day, community members such as Joanne Compton, president of the Johns Creek Historical Society, and Kirk Kennedy, who's a board member of the Johns Creek Historical Society, have worked tirelessly to raise funds and awareness to preserve the cemetery in the new city of Johns Creek. Youth organizations like the Girl Scout troops and Student Leadership Johns Creek have participated in cleaning debris from the cemetery and raising funds to contribute restoring land and headstones. As of April 2021, the Student Leadership Johns Creek fundraised and donated $3,100 to the Johns Creek Historical Society, and with that money have been able to repair and restore 14 grave sites, says Joanne Compton. Furthermore, Mr. Kirk Kennedy asserts that yucca plants and daffodils outside the fenced area indicate that more unmarked graves could be present, raising hopes for this mission. The Macedonia Cemetery is vital to the community of Johns Creek because its preservation can enable learning from the past, enlightening people about the place they live in, while also giving life and value to the people buried at the site. To help with this preservation process, community members, descendants of those buried at Macedonia, the Johns Creek Historical Society, and elected officials have made efforts by continually searching for family members of the people buried at the cemetery. So far, over 60 people buried at the site have been successfully identified. On November 16, 2020, the City of Johns Creek resolved to acquire ownership of the cemetery. Members of the Johns Creek City Council have worked to push forward localized legislation that will allow those in the cemetery to be better respected. For instance, on June 21, 2021, an ordinance was passed that fines those who deface or vandalize the historical site in any manner with a maximum of $1,000 or 6 months in jail. This legislation will help protect Macedonia from further destruction and disrespect. Nevertheless, in the near or late future, what is it we, as a community, envision for the Macedonia Cemetery? In order to preserve the cemetery for generations to come, we must arrange for consistent and determined responsibility of the land by the City of Johns Creek and its residents. Other efforts to preserve the cemetery would be to look for funding and partners and consider future uses. Some of these plans include making the cemetery a historical landmark for local schools to participate in preservation. Jennifer Dickey, head of preservation at Oakland Cemetery, emphasizes the importance of a cemetery and how a cemetery provides the community a space to go. Whether you're related to the people there or not, you could go to a cemetery and find peace or history. Other plans can include adding information plates around the cemetery that highlight the rich history and stories of those buried in Macedonia. In order to do so, we hope the Johns Creek community can continue to come up with steady and long-term goals for the Macedonia Cemetery, taking it step by step to make the Macedonia Cemetery and its stories known to all. Perhaps a special kiosk about the cemetery and its history can be included in the annual Johns Creek Arts Festival? So, what is our role in historic preservation? And why is historical preservation important to any of us? The preservation efforts that have gone on for decades let the cemetery live on, and for the community and the families whose ancestors are buried there. We have so much to learn from the Macedonia Cemetery, and continuing its preservation can help the community of Johns Creek put together parts of histories in ways we did not know we could.
Also, a cemetery provides a community a space to go. Whether they're related to the people there or not, you can go to a cemetery and find peace, and you can go and you learn about history. So cemeteries are important on, a number of levels.
With proper care, value, respect, and importance for the Macedonia Cemetery, generations to come can learn so much. And so, it is our job as a community to play a part in letting the heart of the cemetery live on, for the past, the present, and the future. As Mayor Botker states, we're thankful for our community coming together to preserve the Macedonia Cemetery. This is an important part of our history and a reminder that we must always remember that we are all equal in the eyes of our Creator. It is important to remember history, especially that of dark times, lest we forget and repeat the mistakes of our past.
You can tell a lot about a community by the way in which it cares for the deceased. And although this cemetery at one point was abandoned, the community really rallied around the idea of maintaining this and preserving it. And I think that that's something that speaks very well of the people and community of Johns Creek.
I've lived in Johns Creek about 4 years, and I have learned so much, and making this documentary and doing this historical research, I have learned more than I could ever see possible just in a normal classroom setting, social studies. I have learned a lot about Johns Creek and the land that we are on when it was Native American lands, and I've been able to share it with a lot of my friends and family who have grown up here in Johns Creek, and they've found it as fascinating as I have, and I'm honestly just so grateful to have done that research and been able to educate others on something that's really important and underrated.
I'm very grateful to have worked on the project. I think after all my reflections of working on it, that's the one thing I can say. Because if I hadn't worked on the project, then I wouldn't have been exposed to something that was so real and yet close to us, that wasn't up in the open. And I just want to say I'm grateful for getting to know so many people from the project, and hopefully we will have more to do with the project in the future.
I would say if there are any more opportunities like this for any future students to definitely do it. It really teaches you a lot about social studies, and when you're taking a social studies class and wondering why you're doing all this sourcing for documents, why you have to look at all this stuff, we actually did it during this project, so I think it's actually applicable to real life.
Thank you for watching They Were Here, the future of the preservation and commemoration of the Macedonia African Methodist Cemetery. To see the films again, please visit the Student Leadership Johns Creek YouTube channel or the Student Leadership Johns Creek website.